There comes a point when each person realizes the immutability of their existence, perceiving themselves as a separate self, moving through time, making decisions and experiencing the world from a unique perspective. However, if we delve deeper into this question, a mystery arises. Where exactly is this I that we consider ourselves to be? For centuries, philosophers, mystics, and scientists have sought to unravel this mystery. The ancient Zen masters set their students the task: point me to the I, show me its beginning and end. The disciples, in turn, faced insurmountable difficulties in trying to locate this I. It was not to be found in the mind, in the body, anywhere. And yet, something continued to be realized, observed, heard, and experienced. These days, neuroscientists face a similar problem. They explore the brain in the hope of discovering a central command center, a conductor of consciousness, a single control center. But their search remains futile. Instead, they find only billions of neurons generating a continuous stream of electrical impulses, fleeting thoughts, flashing memories and emotions, surging and receding like the waves of the sea. Where will this search lead? In reality, this process eludes one's control. Nevertheless, a persistent impression persists, as if there is some kind of I, an unbroken narrative line convincing of its authenticity. However, what if it is just another fleeting thought? A closer look reveals that the self is not a static object, but a dynamic process, continuously recreating itself in every moment. It is a narrative told with such conviction that its veracity is rarely questioned. The philosopher David Hume realized this as early as the last centuries when he discovered that the search for a fixed self only leads to the discovery of an ever-changing kaleidoscope of thoughts, perceptions, and sensations. What is most fascinating is this: if the self is merely an illusory story emerging at every moment, then who is the observer of this spectacle? Who hears the inner voice? Who is aware of thoughts and emotions? Here, language proves insufficient, for it is not an object, a person, or even something definable or graspable. It is simply pure awareness, silent, boundless, and ever-present. In ancient spiritual teachings, this phenomenon was referred to as the witness, while the scientific community prefers to speak of the field of consciousness. Regardless of the terminology, the point remains the same. The personality we are accustomed to thinking of as ourselves is nothing more than a character in a fleeting dream, a narrative unfolding within something immeasurably larger. And when this realization enters our consciousness with crystal clarity, transformation occurs. The anxieties, fears, doubts, and obsessive need for proof that previously seemed insurmountable lose their power. The reason is simple: the one who clung to them never existed in reality. This does not mean that life stops. The body continues its activity. Thoughts arise and disappear. Emotions come and go. But now there is a space, a distance, a sense of freedom between the person and the experience. This is why Zen monks bestow laughter on the world when they reach enlightenment. What they were seeking, what they were suffering for, was never lost. It was always here in the present moment. Paradoxically, the search itself was the treasure sought. Hence, the main question is not who we are, but what was always present here and now. The phenomenon of the illusion of control pervades human existence, making us believe in our own ability to control the course of events and make informed decisions. We tend to think of ourselves as the creators of our thoughts and actions, the master of our own destiny. However, a closer look at this process reveals a surprising picture. Consider a simple example: the decision to raise your hand. This action seems to be the result of a conscious choice, but neurobiological research shows that this is not entirely true. Long before we realize the desire to raise our arm, the brain is already activating the appropriate neural circuits, preparing the body for the movement. The conscious I, that inner voice that says, "I have decided to do this," turns out to be just an observer, arriving late to the scene of the action. A legitimate question arises: who then makes the decisions? The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer aptly stated, "Man can do what he wishes, but he cannot wish what he wishes." In other words, we can act on the thoughts that arise, but we have no control over the very arising of those thoughts. Our consciousness thus appears not as the conductor of the orchestra, but rather as a spectator watching it play. Thoughts arise in our consciousness unpredictably, as if from nowhere. Try to anticipate the course of your own thoughts. It is an impossible task. They are born spontaneously, for no apparent reason. If a person has no control over his thoughts and cannot curb impulses, then what is this ephemeral I, which naively believes that controls the situation? It is at this point that a deep inner conflict arises. The belief of being in control of the situation gives a deceptive sense of confidence and power, creating the illusion of controlling one's own life. However, upon closer examination, it becomes obvious that life develops according to its own laws, spontaneously and effortlessly. The heart beats without our conscious participation. Breathing is automatic. The body digests food, and the brain generates emotions. All this is done without the slightest volitional effort on our part. Even the so-called human personality is the result of a complex interaction of genetic predisposition, life experience, and acquired conditioned reflexes. No one chooses his or her personality. Life unfolds as a spectacular spectacle, and the person at its center is merely a character watching and vainly taking credit for what has been predetermined. Over the centuries, eminent mystics and sages have endeavored to convey this profound truth. Taoists call it wu-wei, a state of effortless action, when a person does not try to forcefully manage or control the course of events, but simply floats harmoniously in the flow of life, accepting its natural unfolding. Buddhists, on the other hand, speak of anatta, the realization that there is no separate I, and that the person we are accustomed to thinking of as ourselves is just a constantly changing set of perceptions and sensations. Yet, despite these revelations, the illusion of a separate self persists. Why does this happen? The reason lies in the fact that the mind, by its very nature, is unable to accept its own non-existence. The self, built on thoughts and beliefs, is desperate for confirmation of its reality. It seeks to appropriate, tell stories, and justify its existence. But if one finds the strength to be quiet, if one begins to observe one's inner world without interfering or evaluating, one gradually begins to see the true picture. Thoughts arise spontaneously. but they do not belong to one. Emotions come and go, but they are not an integral part of one. The body moves, breathes, and acts, but there is no separate act that controls this. Life simply happens on its own. And when this realization really penetrates consciousness, a profound transformation takes place. The compulsive need to control everything around you falls away. Fear loses its power, and stress loosens its grip. For the one who has been trying so hard to keep everything under control has never really existed as something separate and isolated. Many people describe this as a moment of true liberation, but it is not a mystical revelation or transcending the physical body, but a clear and undeniable realization that one has never been detached from life itself. The point is that the true self is not an inner voice constantly commenting on what is happening, nor is it a name that authenticates identity, nor is it a personal story we tell ourselves. Rather, it is the observer, the pure consciousness in which the totality of experience unfolds, the space where all phenomena arise and disappear, and this radically changes the perception of reality. We are talking about the so-called illusion of the observer. It seems as if there is a certain I inside the head, which looks at the world through the eyes, like a pilot controlling an airplane from the cockpit. This I, as it seems, controls all processes, makes decisions, and navigates the environment. But a legitimate question arises. Where exactly in the body is this I located? For centuries, scientists, mystics, and philosophers have tried to locate it. Neurobiologists have thoroughly investigated the brain, scanning every neural pathway and recording the slightest manifestations of activity. But the search for the core of the I has not been successful. There was no central command center, no tiny observer looking through the eyes, no fixed identity lurking in the labyrinths of the brain. Long before the triumph of modern science, the ancient Buddhist sages had already hinted at this profound truth. They spoke of anatta, a stunning concept that asserts that the self is but a skillfully woven illusion. The sense of self, that intimate certainty of our individuality, turns out to be nothing more than a fleeting stream of thoughts, turbulent emotions, and fleeting perceptions, artfully woven together by the threads of memory, creating a convincing but still deceptive illusion of continuity. And yet, despite its ephemeral nature, this illusion has tremendous power, deeply rooted in our daily lives. To see for yourself, you can conduct a simple but revealing experiment. Close your eyes and visualize a juicy red apple. The image easily arises in the imagination, but immediately the question arises, who exactly is the spectator of this inner performance? Where is this mysterious inner observer, this witness of our consciousness? Is it located within our brain, this complex center of information processing? Is it enclosed within the confines of our body, this physical shell we call our own? Or is it not bound to any fixed place at all, floating freely in the vastness of consciousness? If we delve into this search, if we strive hard to find the elusive I, we soon begin to notice something strange and disconcerting. The harder we search, the closer we get to the supposed center of our being, the more it slips away, eventually dissolving into a bottomless void. Alan Watts, an insightful philosopher, once compared this search to the futile attempt to discover the one who knows experience, the one who perceives reality itself. It is like the painstaking process of peeling an onion, layer by layer. Each layer seems to indicate the existence of something deeper that underlies it. But when we finally reach the supposed center, we are met only by a disappointing absence, a void that defies definition. And yet, despite this absence, despite the disappearance of the self, something is still aware of it all. Something is still present as the undeniable presence of awareness. This is where words begin to fail us, because although there is no concrete entity that can be confidently called you, there is still the undeniable reality of pure, unfiltered awareness, a presence that is both omnipresent and elusive, fundamental to our experience and yet beyond our full comprehension. Often, people mistakenly identify with the fleeting contents of their consciousness, thoughts, feelings, life's vicissitudes. However, if you step back and become an observer, there is a dramatic change in perception. Thoughts are like the wind. They arise and disappear, but they are not the essence of a person. Emotions are like waves that rise and fall without defining his true nature. Memories, aspirations, fears pass through the consciousness like clouds in the sky. What remains in the end? An unchanging presence, a pure, undistorted being that does not need a separate I to claim it. This is what mystics and sages have been pointing to for centuries. The realization that one is not just in reality, one is reality itself. The entire universe looks at the world through his eyes, recognizing itself in transitory human form. When this realization comes, life is transformed. Gone is the exhausting struggle for self-determination, for holding on to an elusive identity, for protecting a fragile sense of self. There is no longer a need to resist the flow of life, for the one who struggled never existed in the way it was previously imagined. The sense of self as a separate individual may dissolve, giving way to the realization that one is merely a screen on which the drama of life unfolds. At such moments, there is a deep relaxation, a release from the imposed role and illusory control. All that remains is pure, bright, and free perception, like a silent observer. It is a kind of essence that is always present, but is not a person, thought, or emotion. It is a primordial awareness that existed before personality formation, before the assimilation of social roles and self-definitions. It has been around since childhood, when the world was perceived directly and unbiased. It accompanied a person both in joy and in grief. And now, at this moment, it is watching the flow of thoughts arising in consciousness. The question arises, what is it? We can probably assume that it is not an inner voice constantly commenting on actions, evaluating, planning, and analyzing the past. However, a closer look reveals that this inner monologue in the head is not really the true self. This voice has endless conversations, engages in polemics with itself, and even allows for contradictions. It is like a restless radio, running in the background and constantly switching between different roles, points of view, and emotional states. One moment it praises a person by talking about their brilliance, and the next moment it criticizes them by saying they are not good enough. If this voice were truly an integral part of the individual, he would not rebel against himself and would not be able to observe his own utterances. But there is something deeper than this inner voice, someone who notices it. The ancient traditions call this the silent witness, the ever-present awareness that is relentlessly observing, never changing or disturbed by the content of the mind. Neuroscientists have also become interested in this phenomenon and have conducted related studies with results that have been quite surprising. The brain is constantly generating thoughts, but there is no single centralized thinker. Instead, the mind is a collection of competing neural networks that activate and respond to different stimuli. The illusion of a stable and unchanging self is merely a construct created by the brain that stitches together individual fragments of experience into a coherent narrative. However, the more closely one looks into the depths of one's consciousness, the more one realizes that there is no thinking subject there. The sages of the East realized this truth long before scientific discoveries confirmed it. The Taoists spoke of the empty mind, a vast space where thoughts arise and disappear spontaneously, like fleeting clouds in the sky. Zen instructors invited their students to ponder the question, "Who were you before your parents were born?" Seeing it not just as a puzzle, but as a direct call to go beyond mental constructs to something more fundamental. This is where the most exciting part begins, when one begins to observe one's mind from the position of an inquisitive observer, rather than identifying with it. A remarkable transformation takes place. Thoughts lose their power, as if they are losing the roots that bind them to consciousness. Emotions, which seemed all-consuming before, begin to be perceived as waves running on the surface of the boundless ocean. Even the sense of self, the ingrained belief that man is an unchanging and separate entity, is gradually weakening. And then comes a realization that can overturn one's entire worldview. Man has never been a voice in his head, never a name, a person, or a story he tells himself. He is something more, something that transcends these mental constructs. There is always this invisible presence, this silent awareness that needs no name, definition, or any attribute. When the individual abandons the fruitless attempts at self-identification and gets rid of the compulsive need for self-definition, he acquires something immeasurably more than just a person with his own way of life. He becomes life itself, spontaneously experiencing itself, unfolding in its fullness and gliding effortlessly on the waves of being. Reality, in its essence, has never been personified. It does not revolve around an individual self. And yet, here it is, the awake, aware, free observer. The I, gazing intently at itself. There is something disturbing in the contemplation of one's own reflection. At first, one sees in the mirror only a familiar appearance, familiar features and facial expressions. But after a while, there is an elusive transformation. The feeling of recognizability disappears, and there is a feeling as if a complete stranger is looking into. The eyes. This fleeting moment reveals a profound truth. The I, with which one identifies, does not have the immutability that is attributed to it. Neuroscientists are still trying unsuccessfully to localize this elusive self in the depths of the human brain. Scientists have painstakingly mapped emotions, memories, and cognitive processes to neural impulses, revealing the complex interrelationships between mind and brain. However, despite their best efforts, they have failed to discover some central control point, a place where the decision-making self resides. Inside the human mind, there is no supreme leader, no operator sitting at the control panel and giving orders. There is only a complex network of electrical impulses that are activated in response to various stimuli. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus once uttered a wise phrase: "You cannot enter the same river twice." The water in a river is constantly renewed, constantly flowing. The same is true for the human mind. The thoughts that visited us yesterday, the emotions we felt this morning, the identity we cling to so tightly, all are subject to constant change. And yet, each of us continues to experience ourselves as a whole self. Herein lies the paradox. If the self is in a state of continuous transformation, what part of us remains unchanged? It is the part that is aware of the changes taking place, the part that notices our own thoughts, but remains separate from them. It is at this point that ancient wisdom and modern neuroscientific research converge. Eastern traditions for centuries have spoken of the existence of a silent watcher, an awareness that observes the activity of the mind, a presence that is not subject to capture by the fleeting fluctuations of thoughts. Modern scientific research confirms that the activity of the brain is organized in a multi-level way. One section is responsible for generating experiences, while another performs the function of a mere observer. A common misconception is that people identify themselves with their thoughts. However, if this were true, then with the disappearance of a thought, the person himself would also disappear. But it is not so. Something remains unchanged. Something continues to be observed. For thousands of years, Zen Buddhists, yogis, and philosophers have tried to put this into verbal form, but the possibilities of language are insufficient to fully express this idea. They argue that the observer and the observed are different entities. He who records thoughts is not identical with the thoughts themselves. He who realizes emotions is not the emotions themselves. The true self is not the inner voice, but rather the space in which that voice arises. And this radically changes the perception. If a person is not eating his thoughts, whose pain does he feel when he suffers? If he is not his emotions, who is reacting to them? If he is not his identity, what is left when it dissolves? Realizing oneself as an observer is not an abstract philosophical concept, but a very real experience available to everyone. When one ceases to identify with the continuous flow of thoughts and mental constructs created by the mind, when one takes a step back and assumes the position of an outside observer, the veil of illusion begins to dissipate. Behind this veil, something boundless, inexpressibly huge, and at the same time completely empty, but at the same time filled with a kind of incomprehensible fullness, is revealed. If there is an I capable of observing what is going on, then a natural question arises. Who then observes the observer himself? At the moment when a person realizes this reality, even for a moment, a transformation takes place that changes his entire perception. Surely, everyone is familiar with that strange feeling of self-consciousness, when one suddenly realizes that one exists. If these reflections have resonated with you, and at least slightly expanded your horizons of understanding, you should subscribe to the channel to receive even more insights that can radically change the way you look at the world.